name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. For better or worse, we are witnessing history in the making, and frankly, it's hard to know exactly where to start. Of the most immediate importance is what appears to be a nationwide, systematic attempt to steal the 2020 presidential election, an effort which, as we will discuss, Trump lawyer and former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani describes as coming straight from the top of the Democrat Party. In previous episodes of this show, we have discussed how we arrived at this point. How, thanks to Antonio Gramsci and the Frankfurt School of Marxists in the 1930s, the Marxists began what eventually became known as the Long March through the institutions to take over our media, our schools, and our cultural institutions. But, like every battle for survival, we must put that aside for the time being and focus on what will most effectively keep our government from falling into the hands of the left. That will be the focus of today's show. First, what we need to do to maintain control of the United States Senate to prevent leftists from having their way with us if Donald Trump ultimately loses the presidential election. And second, we must understand and counter the sham which sadly has become our election process. And with that, the shocking and deeply poisonous revelations coming from the attorney for Michael Flynn, Sidney Powell, who is now a member of the Trump legal team. But first, this just in gun rights news. First, on the continuing trials and tribulations of the NRA. As reported by gun writer Dave Workman, writing in AmmoLand.com, and I quote, "The National Rifle Association will pay the state of New York $2.5 million to settle a claim by that state's Department of Financial Services that it violated the state's insurance laws by, quote, soliciting and marketing the sale of insurance products under its Carry Guard program, according to ABC News. Under terms of the settlement, NRA will not market insurance in the Empire State for the next 5 years. Unfortunately, however, that does not let the NRA off the hook with New York. Says Workman, and I quote, "The organization is still in the crosshairs of New York Attorney General Letitia James, who sued earlier this year to have the NRA dissolved. NRA was founded in New York State in 1871, making the association subject to New York state law. Why they never moved is beyond me. Anyway, elsewhere, anybody who has had the audacity to actually defend the Bill of Rights by supporting Donald Trump is now also in the crosshairs, this time of the self-proclaimed voice of tolerance. Also writing in AmmoLand.com, David Codrea quoted a sitting member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who tweeted, threateningly, quote, "Is anyone archiving these Trump sycophants for when they try to downplay or deny their complicity in the future? I foresee decent probability of many deleted tweets, writings, and photos in the future. She is not alone, said Codrea. As partial compilation posted by The Blaze proves, included in the story was an idea from former CIA operations officer Evan McMullen, that is, a career feeder from the public trough, an agent of the much ridiculed by the left concept of the deep state who advocates, and I quote, "We should keep and publish a list of everyone who assists Trump's frivolous and dangerous attacks on the election. Name and shame forever. Any R, I guess that's Republican, now promoting rejection of an election or calling to not to follow the will of voters or making baseless allegations of fraud should never serve in office, join a corporate board, find a faculty position, or be accepted into polite society." Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post chimed in, "We have a list." Yeah, but that's not so serious, right? After all, they're just talking about social shaming, right? No. To give you a detailed idea of what your future under the left would look like if they gain complete control, they also want you arrested for what can only be described as Soviet-style political crimes. New Jersey Congressman Bill Pascrell Jr. recently tweeted, and I quote, "Tonight I'm calling for the eventual prosecution of Donald Trump and his enablers for their many crimes against the United States. Donald Trump and members of his administration have committed innumerable crimes against the United States. He has engaged in treachery, in treason." Predictably, Pascrell doesn't stipulate which crimes you, the Trump enabler, might be guilty of, but I'm sure they will be happy to make something up. Elsewhere, you might not know it, but the center of the world is now Georgia. You see, control of the United States Senate is still in play. The good news is that Democrats failed to win what were billed as the 4 pivotal races which would determine control of the Senate. They did win, I believe, 2, but they also lost another seat. One of those races, incidentally, was right here in North Carolina, where we successfully defended Thom Tillis. Yeah, we can ponder the wisdom of that for another day, but in truth, the Democrat target of 4 Senate races to control the chamber only applies if Trump wins the election. If Biden wins, the Democrat target becomes 3, and here's why. In a Senate containing 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, the tie-breaking vote would come from Vice President, and I hate to use these words, Vice President Kamala Harris. We can all shudder now. Incidentally, this has happened in recent history. I believe it was 2002 when the Senate last ended up 50-50, with Vice President Dick Cheney being the tiebreaker, which gave the Republicans effective control of the Senate, and which would give Democrats control of the Senate if Biden wins and if they get 50 seats in the Senate. And that would give control of the entire U.S. government, the White House and both chambers of Congress, to the Democrats, clearing the way for everything Senator Chuck Schumer has already promised: packing the Supreme Court, ending the filibuster to pass better gun control, statehood for Democrat bastions like Puerto Rico and D.C., ensuring they are at their permanent lock on power, and more. Well, surprise, surprise, surprise. Among the many peculiarities of the 2020 elections, in not one but both of the U.S. Senate races in Georgia, no candidate achieved 50% of the vote. Under Georgia law, that means 2 runoff elections on January 5th for the United States Senate, and the Democrats are salivating over the possibility of winning both and control of the Senate. Specifically, Senator Chuck Schumer, who wants to be, God forbid, Senate Majority Leader, has said not once but twice, and I quote, "Now we take Georgia, then we change America." And I can assure you, that the changes he has in mind are not ones you will enjoy. In our next segment, we will discuss our efforts to win the runoff elections in Georgia and retain control of the U.S. Senate. Right now, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with how we can win Georgia and how Donald Trump plans to win the presidential election. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Before our break, we were discussing how two runoff elections on January 5th will determine whether Democrats control the U.S. Senate, and with it, the ability to pass all of their agenda, including packing the Supreme Court, statehood for leftist bastions like Puerto Rico and D.C., ending the filibuster, and, of course, what that clears the way for, enacting Joe Biden's entire gun control agenda. Now, believe it or not, some gun owners prior to the election were not convinced that Joe Biden would ban guns. To them, I can only say that you need only check his campaign website, which lays it out quite clearly. And rest assured, the Democrats are salivating over the possibility of controlling the Senate and thereby consolidating their power over the entire federal government. Senator Chuck Schumer, who wants to be, God forbid, Senate Majority Leader, has said not once but twice, "Now we take Georgia, then we change America." I did a lengthy interview on this on the superb YouTube show Guns and Gadgets, which you should check out, not just for my interview, but for the accurate and timely information that Guns and Gadgets provides. What I said was that it all comes down to January 5th in Georgia and the runoff election for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue against anti-gun leftists Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. So, the volunteers of my organization, Grassroots North Carolina, have geared up an effort to empower Georgia gun voters in what we call the Save the Senate campaign, which can be found at saveussenate.org. saveussenate.org. To do this, we plan to use many of the same techniques that we used to win the elections this year in North Carolina, namely mass distribution of information to activate gun owners beyond the paid membership of any single organization, distributing 100,000 Save the Senate cards to motivate gun voters to vote, through all gun shows through the January 5th runoff, more than 200 gun shops across the state, mailings and email to as many as 250,000 gun voters, and walking campaigns to voters, which we will coordinate with our friends at Gun Owners of America. But our first action is to demand that Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger not certify these fraudulent results. Unfortunately, as I write this, he has just done that. Now, that doesn't mean the game is over. We further demand that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp immediately convene the legislature to appoint electors who will actually represent the will of Georgia voters rather than the fraudulent results that have been certified. To kick this off, we're asking people to sign the petition by going to saveussenate.org. Again, saveussenate.org. To give you an idea of the two Democrats who need to be defeated and what they're all about, the Reverend Raphael Warnock has rubbed shoulders with Fidel Castro and the radical Reverend Jeremiah Wright. You remember him, right? That would be Barack Obama's buddy who curses America in what he calls sermons. Warnock supports gun control, but has been particularly vocal also in what are supposed to be sermons, against churchgoers being able to carry firearms for protection against the various whack jobs targeting churches. Then we have Jon Ossoff, maybe it's Ossoff, I don't know, I think it's Ossoff, who insists that he supports the Second Amendment, but have you ever noticed that anti-gunners love to start off with, I support the Second Amendment, but, and then they go on to list various unconstitutional gun bans. So on his campaign website, Ossoff says he supports gun safety reforms, never gun control there, gun safety reforms, more lessons on gun safety from idiots that don't know which end of the gun spits out a bullet. But anyways, safety reforms such as semi-auto bans, magazine bans, universal gun registration, red flag confiscation, pretty much the usual gun control wish list. So help us save the Senate, folks, by going to saveussenate.org. So, how about that election? Rigged? Nah, couldn't happen. Move along, folks, nothing to see here, at least if the ostensibly mainstream media is to be believed. Of course, Democrats have been fixing elections since Tammany Hall, but the Trump legal team press conference on Thursday gives truly frightening details. Rudy Giuliani discussed the hundreds of affidavits they have attesting to election fraud, including all manner of very, very clear fraud. He detailed exactly how such fraud has worked in several states. He posited that the pervasiveness of the fraud must by inference mean that it was a coordinated effort from the top of the Democrat Party, including Joe Biden's Freudian slip that he has, quote, the best election fraud team in the world. Indeed. But perhaps the scariest details were provided by Sidney Powell, attorney for Michael Flynn, who has for 2 weeks now been describing systematic digital vote fraud by Dominion Voting Systems and Smartmatic, whose digital DNA, as they describe it, she says exists in all voting software. So terrifying, in fact, are Powell's allegations that our voting system has been utterly compromised by outside actors that I will now play you her comments in their entirety. Here they are.
What we are really dealing with here and uncovering more by the day is the massive influence of communist money through Venezuela, Cuba, and likely China in the interference with our elections here in the United States. The Dominion voting systems, the Smartmatic technology software, and the software that goes in other computerized voting systems here as well, not just Dominion, were created in Venezuela at the direction of Hugo Chavez to make sure he never lost an election after one constitutional referendum came out the way he did not want it to come out. We have one very strong witness who has explained how it all works. His affidavit is attached to the pleadings of Lynn Wood in the lawsuit he filed in Georgia. It is a stunning, detailed affidavit because he was with Hugo Chavez while he was being briefed on how it worked. He was with Hugo Chavez when he saw it operate to make sure the election came out his way. That was the express purpose for creating this software. He has seen it operate, and as soon as he saw the multiple states shut down the voting on the night of the election, he knew the same thing was happening here, that was what had gone on. Now, the software itself was created with so many variables and so many back doors that can be hooked up to the internet or a thumb drive stuck in it or whatever. But one of its most characteristic features is its ability to flip votes. It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden, which we might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm that had been plugged into the system. And that's what caused them to have to shut down in the states they shut down in. That's when they came in the back door with all the mail-in mail-in ballots, many of which they had actually fabricated. Some were on pristine paper with identically matching perfect circle dots for Mr. Biden. Others were shoved in batches. They're always put in a certain number of batches, and people would rerun the same batch. This corresponds to our statistical evidence that shows incredible spikes in the vote counts at particular times, and that corresponds to eyewitness testimony of numerous people who have come forward and said they saw the ballots come in the back door at that time. Notably, the Dominion executives are nowhere to be found now. They are moving their offices overnight to different places. Their office in Toronto was shared with one of the Soros entities. One of the leaders of the Dominion project overall is Lord Malloch Brown, Mr. Soros' number 2 person in the UK, and part of his organization. There are ties of the Dominion leadership to the Clinton Foundation and to other known politicians in this country.
We will break it there and pick it up again after a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After our break, we will return with more of attorney Sidney Powell describing how massive digital vote fraud rigged the 2020 elections. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Before the break, we were listening to attorney Sidney Powell, now with the Trump legal team, describing exactly how the Democrats stole the 2020 election. We will resume that.
Just to give you a brief description of how this worked, I'm going to quote from a letter that was written, and I will read that to make sure I get the quotes right. This person was objecting to the United States acquisition of Sequoia voting systems by Smartmatic, a foreign-owned company. I believe this transaction raises exactly the sort of foreign ownership issues that CFIUS is best positioned to examine for national security purposes. It's undisputed that Smartmatic is foreign-owned and it has acquired Sequoia. They keep changing the names as they go along. Different times when a problem comes up, they just create another corporation and call it a different name. But it was a voting machine company doing business in the United States. Sequoia voting machines were used to record over 125 million votes during the 2004 presidential election in the United States. Smartmatic now acknowledges that Antonio Mujica, a Venezuelan businessman, has controlling interest in Smartmatic, but the company has not revealed who all the Smartmatic owners are. According to the press, Smartmatic's owners are hidden through a web of offshore private entities, and that is in fact true. Smartmatic has been associated with the Venezuelan government led by Hugo Chavez, which is openly hostile to the United States, and of course, as we all know, communistic and really brutalizing its own people. The system has been continued there by Mr. Maduro and ensured his election. Smartmatic's possible connection to the Venezuelan government poses a potential national security concern in the context of its acquisition of Sequoia, because electronic voting machines are susceptible to tampering, and insiders are in the best position to engage in such tampering. This letter expresses concern of the Chicago 2006 primary election. And it ends by saying the products and services that are of Venezuelan origin, and evaluate Smartmatic's ownership to determine who could have influence and control over these and other Sequoia products and services are important to the national security of the United States. This letter was written to Hank Paulson on October 6, 2006 by Congresswoman Carolyn B. Maloney. Senators Klobuchar and Warren have raised these concerns as recently as December 2019. Why our government has not taken them seriously is beyond my comprehension, unless they have, some of the three-letter agencies have used them themselves in other parts of the world. We know that the technology was exported to affect an election in Argentina. That's admitted by our friend who wrote the affidavit about Hugo Chavez and his interest in Smartmatic. Again, in 2006, Carolyn Maloney wrote the Honorable John Snow, the Secretary of the Treasury, about the issues. Speaking of Smartmatic's leadership, one of the Smartmatic patent holders, Eric Coomer, I believe his name is on the web as being recorded in a conversation with Antifa members saying that he had the election rigged for Mr. Biden, nothing to worry about here, and they were going to F Trump. His social media is filled with hatred for the president and for the United States of America as a whole, as are the social media accounts of many other Smartmatic people. There has been widespread use of this. Dominion itself is utilized in 2,000 jurisdictions in 30 states. It has been uncertifiable in multiple states who realized all the problems that it had, including Texas. Experts have described it across the board, from a Princeton group of 3 professors to experts that we have talked to about its end-user vulnerabilities. People can admittedly go in and change whatever they want. They can set the ratio of votes from one thing to another. They can say that a Biden vote counts as 1.25 and a Trump vote counts as 0.75. And those may be the numbers that were actually used here. It's not just the swing states that were affected. The algorithm was likely run across the country to affect the entire election. Like I said, we only discovered it this year because of the overwhelming number of votes for President Trump in the swing states that caused the machines to have to shut down for them to backfill for adding votes. We have evidence of different numbers of votes being injected into the system, the same identical, unique 6-digit number multiple times in at least 2 states that we've analyzed so far, and I'm talking about like 341,542 votes for Biden and 100,012 for Trump. There's no explanation, no logical explanation for the same numbers being injected 20 minutes apart into the machine. The software manual itself, you can download it from the internet, and I would encourage you all to read it because it specifically advertises some of these things as features of the system. Why it was ever allowed into this country is beyond my comprehension, and why nobody has dealt with it is absolutely appalling. The machines were easily accessible to hackers. There's a video on the net that it will explain to you how a kid with a cell phone can hack one of these voting machines. There's been no oversight of Dominion or its software. Workers in each county were trained by Dominion, but there's no evidence of any monitoring otherwise. We have testimony of different workers admitting that they were trained how to dispose of Trump votes and add to Biden votes. The software has a feature pursuant to which you can drag and drop any number of batches of votes to the candidate of your choice or simply throw them away. So we have mathematical evidence in a number of states of massive quantities of Trump votes being trashed. Just simply put it in the trash like you would on your computer with any file, and Biden votes being injected. That's addition to the flipping. I mean, it really happens in 2 ways. There's an algorithm that runs that automatically flips all the votes, and then each operator has the ability to go in, override settings. They can ignore a signature. They can ignore the top line of the ballot. They can go down ballot and select who they want to change the results for. The gentleman who founded Smartmatic, there's video of him on the internet explaining that yes, on at least one occasion he admits they changed 1 million votes with no problem. Many of the jurisdictions that have had this problem might not have known of the issues, but Many did. And I think a full-scale criminal investigation needs to be undertaken immediately by the Department of Justice and by every state's equivalent, Attorney General's office or state investigatory unit, because there's evidence of different benefits being provided to the people who spent $100 million of taxpayer money at the last minute for their state to get the Dominion voting systems put in time for this election in different ways. There's one person that a lawyer told me got, quote, election insurance, meaning that he would be able to make sure he was elected. I'm sure they explained that feature in detail to many people who expressed interest in putting this voting system in. Texas denied certification of the Dominion system in 2019, but there are no doubt issues with the software that Texas did use, unbeknownst to Texas, I would imagine, since they went to great trouble to examine the Dominion systems and reject them. But other software, in the source code that does the alterations is embedded, we have been told, in the source code all across the country in all the voting machines. There's no doubt it has been used to alter elections in other countries. We know specifically that Venezuela exported it for that purpose to Argentina and other Latin American companies to make sure that the corrupt rulers who were willing to pay the highest price for being in office were allowed to rig their elections. This is stunning, heartbreaking, infuriating, and the most unpatriotic acts I can even imagine for people in this country to have participated in any way, shape, or form. And I want the American public to know right now that we will not be intimidated. American patriots are fed up with the corruption from the local level to the highest level of our government, and we are going to take this country back. We are not going to be intimidated. We are not going to back down. We are going to clean this mess up now. President Trump won by a landslide. We are going to prove it, and we are going to reclaim the United States of America for the people who vote for freedom.
You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with a discussion of what happens next in the election and what Donald Trump might have in mind to win it. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. In the last segment, we listened to attorney Sidney Powell describe what may be the most audacious election steal in American history. And by the way, I forgot to mention that Giuliani described how their legal team has lost lawyers because of threats against them and their families. That's how the left works. And not coincidentally, we here at GRNC have received threats over our intent to help win Georgia. Rest assured, threats will not dissuade us. Following Powell in the press conference was Jenna Ellis, the very sharp senior legal advisor to the Trump team, who, in addition to describing the shamelessness of the media in refusing to cover the voter fraud, also noted that Trump was not just trying to win an election, but more importantly, trying to save free elections in our republic. One of the things Ellis pointed out was that the points they made in the conference comprised an, quote, opening statement, end quote. The point, of course, is that the Although the jackal-pack media have been screaming that the Trump team should be producing evidence for the media in only the 2 weeks since the election, the team is in fact making an opening statement indicating they have reams of evidence that they intend to produce once they get to court. Ellis also described the rampant voter fraud as irredeemably corrupted. Remember that phrase, irredeemably corrupted. I believe that term was used deliberately and carefully and is likely the key to Trump's intended goal, probably from the beginning. The fact is, recounts won't help. Take Georgia, for example. The recount has so far featured double counting of ballots for Joe Biden, multiple sworn affidavits of Trump ballots being counted for Biden, affidavits attesting to pristine, uncreased mailed ballots, which would have to have been folded to be mailed. Of course, they were uniformly and perfectly filled out for Biden. One batch of such ballots, with 500 ballots in a row, were all cast for Biden. And this is the recount. Forget the November 3rd election, which featured missing military ballots, thousands of missing votes, thousands of people voting twice, poll watchers prohibited from ensuring fairness of the election, and of course, much, much more. But all of this is secondary to exactly what Rudy Giuliani and Ellis are saying, namely that recounting corrupted ballots accomplishes nothing. It just perpetuates the fraud. These ballots were irredeemably corrupted and cannot be counted to produce a fair election. The Epoch Times recently did an interview with Representative Mo Brooks, Republican of Alabama, who described the flaws in our system of voting and one possible path for Donald Trump to win the election. First, Brooks described how our system has been designed for decades to produce voter fraud. For example, he cites the Voter Registration Act of 1993, which actually prohibits election personnel from confirming whether voters are, as required by law, American citizens. Similarly, under a variety of pretexts, mostly related to claimed racism, the left has spent years, decades, opposing voter ID laws, even suing to get ours thrown out twice. Republicans bent over backwards to satisfy Democrats' demands by making it as easy as possible for anybody, and I mean anybody who wants to vote, to get a suitable ID. But of course, none of that mattered to the left-wing activists who sued to strike down our voter ID law because what they were really interested in is winning elections through fraud. But by far the most useful information Brooks relayed to the Epoch Times was his blow-by-blow on how the election of the president might work if ballots from battleground states are indeed irredeemably corrupted. The interview is entitled Exclusive, Representative Mo Brooks. Will the U.S. House of Representatives decide the next president? And here it is, roughly a 3-minute clip in which Brooks describes the process.
Now, how do you do that in the United States Congress? Well, on January the 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, the 50 states will report to Congress. The President of the Senate will preside over this meeting, will report to Congress what they contend are the Electoral College results in their state. If a House member and a senator objects to the submission of Electoral College votes by any state, that immediately triggers a House floor vote and a Senate floor vote on whether to accept or reject those Electoral College votes submitted by that particular state. The amount of debate on the House and Senate floor is limited to 2 hours under federal law. And if we reject those Electoral College votes, then they're taken out of the mix. If the election process problems are so great that after subtracting the Electoral College votes of states that are running a poor election system, a system so suspect that you can't give credibility to the results that are being reported, then The United States Constitution mandates that Congress determine who the next president and vice president of the United States will be. Under Article 1, Article 2, and Amendment 12 to the United States Constitution, the House of Representatives will be the body that determines who is president of the United States. The vice president will be determined by the United States Senate, and they can even be members of different parties if that's the will of the House and the Senate. Now in the House, there's a little bit of a twist. It's not a majority of 435 congressmen that determines who the President of the United States will be. Rather, it is a majority of the state delegations that determines who the President of the United States will be. That being the case, based on the election we just had a couple of weeks ago, the Republicans control 26 state delegations. The Democrats control 20 state delegations, with the remainder being tied with the possible exception of Iowa. There's an uncalled Iowa House race. If that is called in favor of the GOP candidate, who's up, last I saw, about 47 votes, then there will be 27 state delegations that have a majority of their members being Republican. Hence, the House would be in a position to elect a Republican to the White House based on what we saw a couple of weeks ago on Election Day earlier in November, November the 3rd. I don't know who the Senate would elect as the vice president. That would be up to them. But that's the process that is embedded in the United States Constitution. Should no candidate get a majority of the Electoral College vote, either because there's a tie or because there are so many candidates, as was the case in 1824, where there were 4 candidates that split the vote, so no one got a majority, and the House then elected the second place finisher, John Quincy Adams, to be President of the United States over Andrew Jackson, who came in first. Or should it be the case that you've discounted Electoral College votes such that no candidate for President of the United States got the magic number of 270, which is a majority of the Electoral College?
You will probably hear that if the election takes this course, we've encountered a constitutional crisis. But is it a constitutional crisis? Not at all. The framers widely planned for just these contingencies. They planned for them in an electoral college that is designed to protect against voter fraud, and in having Congress be the final authority on deciding on certifying electors and declaring the winners of the presidential and vice presidential elections. What you are seeing in action is the beauty of the intricate balance of powers given to us by the framers. Remember that the next time you hear somebody call for dissolving the Electoral College. The left wants that, of course, for the same reasons they oppose voter ID laws and engage in systematic, widespread voter fraud. And that reason is the left's naked lust for power. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker. Don't forget to help us win the Senate by going to SaveUSSenate.org. That's SaveUSSenate.org. Our show has been sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. I also encourage you to check out my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, spell out the and, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of this show. See you next week.